Hey guys, tonight we begin with a mug of weak ale at 6 in the morning. It's 1347, you're a stonemason in London, and you've just woken to the sound of church bells. Your throat's dry, your head aches, and you need something to drink. You reach for water and immediately remember. That's how people die. The well down the street killed 3 families last month. The river's where everyone dumps their waste. Your neighbor's kid drank rainwater and hasn't stopped vomiting for a week. So you do what every sensible person does. You pour yourself a beer. Not because you want to get drunk, though that'll happen eventually. Because in medieval Europe, staying sober wasn't wisdom, it was suicide. If this sounds like your kind of historical deep dive, something that connects medieval survival strategies to modern work culture in ways that'll make your morning commute feel historical, hit the like button and subscribe to Candle History. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing where in the world people are joining these late-night history sessions. And now, get settled in for the next couple of hours while we explore how alcohol became the only safe thing to drink, how night work rewired human sleep, and how bells designed for prayer became the prototype for your alarm clock. This is gonna get dark, literally. The medieval water crisis was simple. Every source was contaminated. Rivers received waste from tanneries, slaughterhouses, and open sewers. Wells sat near burial grounds and livestock. Rain barrels grew algae and mosquito larvae. Drinking water was basically Russian roulette, played 3 times a day. People knew it made them sick. They'd watched neighbors die from bad water for generations. They just didn't understand why, because germ theory wouldn't be invented for another 5 centuries. Medieval medical theory blamed miasma, bad air that corrupted liquids. Close, but spectacularly wrong. What they did understand was patterns. Drink from the well, get fever and death. Drink beer, feel fine, except for the hangover. The correlation was obvious, even if the causation wasn't. Beer was boiled during brewing. That alone killed most pathogens. Then the alcohol and hops acted as preservatives, keeping the liquid relatively safe for days or weeks. Medieval people weren't drinking because they enjoyed it, though many did. They were drinking because it was the only beverage that reliably didn't kill you. This created a civilization running on low-grade intoxication around the clock. Workers started their day with ale. Breakfast beer, they called it, though breakfast is generous for what was usually stale bread dunked in fermented barley. Construction crews drank while hauling stone. Farmers drank while plowing fields. Monks drank between prayers. Children drank weaker versions called small beer. Everyone, from nobles to peasants, organized their entire existence around consuming enough alcohol to stay hydrated without dying of dysentery. It was the medieval equivalent of carrying a water bottle, except your water bottle could get you fired from a modern job. The economics of this were fascinating and depressing. Towns had official alewives, women who brewed in large batches for their neighborhoods. This was one of the few trades where women dominated, partly because brewing was considered similar to cooking, therefore feminine, and partly because it happened at home. These women provided essential infrastructure. Without them, entire communities would have died of thirst. Yet they were paid poorly, regulated heavily, and frequently accused of witchcraft when their beer went bad. Because obviously contaminated grain and temperature fluctuations were evidence of demonic intervention, not quality control issues. Taverns became critical to urban life. These weren't just drinking establishments, they were hydration stations. Workers couldn't survive shifts without regular access to ale. Construction sites kept barrels on hand. Guilds negotiated beer breaks into contracts. When records mention workers receiving wages in beer, that's not a bonus, that's survival. A mason in 14th century York might receive a gallon of ale per day as part of his compensation. That sounds excessive until you realize it's either drink that or die of cholera. The modern equivalent would be if your employer paid you in bottled water because tap water was lethal. This created interesting social dynamics. Drunkenness was simultaneously normal and scandalous. Everyone was drunk by modern standards. They had to be. But being too drunk was a moral failing. The line between necessary intoxication and sinful excess was blurry and constantly negotiated. Church officials railed against drunkenness while themselves consuming wine at every meal. Nobles condemned peasants for tavern culture while maintaining private cellars. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but the alternative was mass death by contaminated water. So everyone just drank and pretended they weren't. The health implications were exactly what you'd expect. Chronic low-level alcohol consumption causes liver damage, malnutrition, and shortened lifespans. But those problems developed over decades. Waterborne illness killed in days. From a pure survival calculus, the alcohol was the better choice. This wasn't medieval stupidity. This was medieval pragmatism faced with impossible options. Drink and maybe die at 50 from liver failure. Don't drink and definitely die at 30 from typhoid. Not exactly a difficult decision. Some people tried alternatives. Boiling water worked, obviously, but required fuel, which was expensive, and fire, which was dangerous. Wine worked, but cost more than most people could afford. Milk worked briefly, but spoiled quickly in pre-refrigeration conditions. Tea and coffee hadn't reached Europe yet. So for the vast majority of the population, weak ale was the only viable option. They drank it like we drink water, constantly, casually, necessarily. The difference is water doesn't give you a buzz. Their entire civilization functioned with a blood alcohol level that would fail a breathalyzer test. Modern comparisons are inevitable. We live in a society where caffeine plays a similar role. Coffee isn't just recreational. It's functional fuel for an economy that demands constant alertness. Medieval ale was functional fuel for bodies that needed hydration without pathogens. Both substances create dependency. Both became so normalized that abstaining seems strange. The difference is caffeine doesn't impair judgment quite as dramatically as alcohol, though anyone who's seen a colleague before their morning coffee might debate that. The medieval world was essentially running on day-drunk energy, trying to build cathedrals. It's frankly amazing anything got accomplished. The work culture this created was bizarre. Jobs that today would be considered safety sensitive, operating heavy equipment, working at heights, handling dangerous materials, were all performed by people who'd been drinking since breakfast. Construction accidents were frequent. Falls from scaffolding killed constantly. Tools slipped, cutting off fingers and hands. Some of that was poor safety protocols, but some of it was definitely because everyone was mildly drunk. Medieval health and safety regulations basically consisted of try not to die, and if you do die, please do it away from the expensive materials. Employers accepted this because they had no choice. If you demanded sober workers, you'd have no workers. Everyone drank because not drinking meant risking disease. This created a labor force that was perpetually impaired, but also perpetually alive, which was the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Productivity was lower than it could have been, quality control suffered, but the alternative was a workforce that died of dysentery before finishing any project. So medieval managers learned to accept drunk workers as simply how the world operated. That's the baseline. We work from there. Religious communities weren't exempt. Monasteries brewed their own beer and consumed impressive quantities. Monks had elaborate justifications for this. Beer was liquid bread, they claimed. Fasting from food but not beer was perfectly acceptable because liquids didn't count. St. Benedict's rule for monasteries specified a hemina of wine per day per monk, roughly 1/3 of a liter, and that was the minimum. During feast days or when guests visited, consumption increased dramatically. The stereotype of jolly drunk monks singing in cellars isn't medieval slander. It's documented reality. These religious communities actually advanced brewing technology. Monks were literate, kept records, and experimented with recipes. They figured out that hops acted as preservatives, extending beer's shelf life. They developed different styles for different purposes. Strong beer for cold months, light beer for summer, beer for the sick, beer for celebrations. They weren't doing this for profit or pleasure. They were solving logistics problems. How do you keep a community of 50 men hydrated year-round when water will kill them? You brew constantly and carefully, treating fermentation as a form of prayer. God provides grain. Man turns it into something that won't cause intestinal distress. Circle of life. The economics of medieval brewing created interest in power dynamics. Alewives had enormous practical power despite low social status. They controlled the supply of the only safe beverage. This gave them leverage. When prices rose, workers complained to lords and guilds. When quality dropped, riots could follow. Towns regulated brewing carefully, setting prices, inspecting batches, and punishing fraud harshly. Diluting beer or using contaminated ingredients could result in fines, public humiliation, or banishment. The punishment wasn't about morality. It was about public health. Watering down ale might expose people to actual water. That could trigger epidemics. So authorities treated brewing quality as a matter of civic survival. This created one of history's stranger economic systems. The means of hydration production were distributed among working-class women who sold their product at government-controlled prices to a captive market that literally couldn't survive without it. It was simultaneously free market and command economy, capitalism and socialism. Except instead of debates about efficiency versus equity, everyone just wanted to not die of cholera. The ideological implications didn't matter. The alewives brewed, the workers drank, the system functioned, and everyone accepted mild intoxication as the cost of staying alive. Children's consumption deserves particular attention. Kids drank small beer, a weaker version with lower alcohol content, but they still drank it daily. From an age when modern parents are debating juice versus milk. Medieval parents were given toddlers fermented grain water because the alternative was watching those toddlers die from contaminated water sources. There's no evidence this caused developmental problems, probably because the alcohol content was genuinely low and their bodies adapted. But imagine explaining to a modern pediatrician that your entire civilization gives children beer for breakfast. The conversation would be fascinating and possibly result in CPS involvement. Some historians argue people weren't actually as drunk as this sounds because they developed tolerance. That's partially true. Chronic exposure to alcohol increases tolerance, allowing people to function at blood alcohol levels that would incapacitate someone without that adaptation. But tolerance doesn't eliminate impairment. It just makes the impairment less noticeable. Those workers were still drunk. They were just drunk in a way that let them perform labor without falling over. The medieval baseline for sobriety would register as impaired by modern standards. They lived in a permanently altered state, normalized through necessity. The transition to safer water sources took centuries and only happened gradually as cities developed infrastructure. Wells with sealed tops, aqueducts bringing water from distant, clean sources. Eventually, in the modern era, water treatment plants. But even in the 1800s, many European cities still had populations that preferred beer to water, because cultural memory held that water was dangerous. The generations who'd lived through cholera outbreaks knew beer was safer. It took decades of public health campaigns to convince people that yes, this water actually won't kill you, we promise. Trust was hard won because for so long it had been misplaced. This brings us to night and how it changed everything. Because drinking all day created obvious problems. Drunk workers need rest, lots of it. The medieval work-sleep cycle was completely different from ours. People didn't sleep through the night. They couldn't. Partly because of alcohol's effects on sleep quality. Partly because of the bells. Church bells governed medieval life with tyrannical precision. They rang for prayers 7 or 8 times daily, starting before dawn and continuing past sunset. Each bell marked a canonical hour, points in the day when monks were required to pray. Matins at midnight, lauds at 3 a.m., prime at sunrise, tierce, sext, none through the day, vespers at evening, compline at bedtime. These weren't gentle chimes. They were loud bronze declarations that shook buildings and woke entire towns. The bells weren't asking whether you wanted to wake up. They were informing you that waking was mandatory. For monks, this made sense. Sorta. Their entire purpose was prayer. If prayer happened at 3 a.m., you got up and prayed. Simple. Terrible for sleep architecture, but simple. The problem was, everyone else heard the bells too. Medieval cities were compact. Sound traveled. When the monastery bell rang at midnight, the entire town woke. Some went back to sleep. Others didn't. This created what historians call segmented sleep, a pattern where people slept in 2 shifts with a period of wakefulness in between. The typical medieval sleeper went to bed shortly after sunset, around 8 or 9 p.m. They'd sleep until midnight or 1 a.m. when the bells woke 'em. Then they'd be awake for an hour or 2. During this time, they'd pray, have sex, do light chores, visit neighbors, or just lie in the dark thinking medieval thoughts. Then they'd sleep again until dawn, when more bells announced it was time to work. This wasn't insomnia. This was normal. Sleep studies of people without artificial light show similar patterns. Humans naturally segment sleep when not exposed to electric lighting. The medieval bells just formalized and enforced a pattern that was probably semi-natural anyway. The medieval bells just formalized and enforced a pattern that was probably semi-natural anyway. But the bells did something else. They trained populations to respond to external time signals. Before mechanical clocks, bells were how communities coordinated. When the bell rang, you knew what time it was and what you should be doing. The bell for prime meant start working. The bell for sext meant stop for lunch. The bell for vespers meant finish the day. This was the beginning of scheduled labor, of divorcing work time from natural daylight rhythms and instead connecting it to arbitrary signals that someone else controlled. The monastery bell was the prototype for the factory whistle, the time clock, and your phone alarm. This had profound effects on how people experienced time. Previously, time was approximate. You worked when there was light. You stopped when it got dark. Seasons determined schedules more than hours. But bells created standardized time. The hour between terce and sext was an hour whether summer or winter, though its actual duration varied because canonical hours were calculated differently. Still, the principle was established. External signals, not internal rhythms or environmental cues, would govern human activity. This was revolutionary and dystopian in equal measure. Revolutionary because it enabled coordination at scale. Dystopian because it meant your sleep schedule was now subject to someone else's religious timetable. Night work emerged from this bell-driven culture. Fire watchers stood in towers through dark hours, watching for smoke and flame. They rang alarm bells when danger appeared, adding to the sonic chaos. Night watchmen patrolled streets, enforcing curfews, calling out the hours, and generally ensuring that everyone who should be asleep actually was. Bakers worked nights because bread needed to be fresh by morning, meaning someone had to start baking around 2 a.m. The night shift existed in medieval Europe, and it was miserable. Working at night in pre-electric conditions meant working by candlelight or oil lamp. These provided minimal illumination, created fire hazards, and filled workspaces with smoke. Night workers breathed soot constantly, damaging their lungs. They had higher accident rates because they literally couldn't see what they were doing. They suffered from disrupted sleep because humans are diurnal animals who function poorly in darkness. And they faced social stigma because being awake at night was associated with crime, debauchery, and demonic activity. Night workers were necessary but suspect. Society needed them but didn't trust them. The fire watcher's job perfectly illustrates this. High in a stone tower, exposed to weather, alone for hours, he watched the city below for any sign of smoke. His eyes strained in darkness, trying to distinguish between normal chimney smoke and the irregular plume of an uncontrolled fire. If he missed one, buildings burned and people died. If he raised false alarms too often, he was punished. The stress was immense. Many took to drinking on duty, which was technically forbidden, but practically inevitable. You're stuck in a cold tower all night watching for disasters. Of course you bring alcohol. It's the only thing that makes the job bearable. The fact that being drunk made you worse at spotting fires was a problem everyone acknowledged and nobody solved. Night watchmen faced similar issues. Armed with lanterns and staves, they walked dark streets looking for trouble. Criminals, fires, people violating curfew. They were supposed to protect citizens, but were usually underpaid, poorly trained, and frightened of the dark themselves. Many slept on duty. Others drank. Some were corrupt, accepting bribes to ignore curfew violations or look the other way during burglaries. The job attracted people who couldn't get better work, which meant you had the least qualified individuals responsible for nighttime security. Medieval cities at night were terrifying, partly because the people tasked with making them safe were only marginally more competent than the dangers they were supposed to prevent. Bakers' night work was different. They actually needed darkness to make morning bread. This meant entire families lived on inverted schedules. Children of bakers grew up never seeing their parents in daylight. They'd wake as their parents slept, sleep as their parents worked. The social cost was real. Baker families often isolated themselves because their schedules didn't align with anyone else's. Marriages suffered, children struggled, and the bakers themselves accumulated health problems from chronic sleep deprivation and constant exposure to heat and flour dust. They provided essential services, but paid with their bodies and relationships. The introduction of night work revealed something important about human labor. Work isn't just about accomplishing tasks. It's embedded in social rhythms. When you force people to work at night, you're not just changing their schedule. You're removing them from communal life. They can't attend evening gatherings. They can't participate in festivals. They can't even have normal conversations because they're asleep when everyone else is awake. Night workers became a separate class, necessary but excluded, essential but isolated. This pattern would intensify dramatically during industrialization. Medieval solutions to night work problems were primitive. More alcohol, mostly. If working at night was miserable, being drunk made it less miserable. Employers provided beer or ale as part of night wages. Workers supplemented with whatever they could afford. The result was night shifts performed by exhausted, impaired people using dangerous tools in dim lighting. Accidents were constant. Injuries went untreated because medieval medicine was barely functional in daylight, let alone at midnight. Some night workers simply vanished, falling into rivers or construction pits, or being murdered by criminals, with nobody certain which, because darkness hid everything. Lighting technology drove much of this misery. Candles were expensive and dangerous. Oil lamps provided slightly better light but cost more. Most workers relied on rushlights, dried rushes soaked in animal fat that burned briefly and gave off horrible smoke. These barely illuminated anything. Working by rushlight was like working in a permanent twilight, just enough vision to attempt tasks, but not enough to do them safely. Modern people complain about fluorescent office lighting. Medieval night workers would have killed for fluorescence, literally killed. Murder rates among night workers were notably high. Some industries developed around night work. Tanning required soaking hides for hours. This happened at night because the smell was intolerable during the day when people were out. Dyers worked at night for similar reasons. Certain types of fishing happened at night. Smuggling, obviously, was nocturnal. Prostitution operated largely after dark. This created a shadow economy where night was the productive time and day was for sleep. These workers became culturally distinct, developing their own slang, customs, and social networks. Day workers viewed them with suspicion. Night workers returned the sentiment. The medieval city was actually two cities occupying the same space at different times, with minimal overlap between them. Curfews attempted to control nighttime activity. Most cities required citizens to be indoors by a certain hour, usually announced by bells. The couvre-feu, or cover fire, bell signaled that hearth fires should be banked and everyone should be inside. This was partly fire prevention, since unattended fires caused disasters. But it was also social control. Authorities didn't trust people wandering at night. Too many opportunities for crime, sin, or unauthorized assembly. So they criminalized being outside after curfew, with exceptions for specific night workers who carried tokens proving their legitimate business. Enforcement was inconsistent. Night watchmen were supposed to arrest curfew violators, but watchmen were few, streets were many, and darkness hid everything. Most people violated curfew regularly with little consequence. The rules existed less to actually control movement and more to provide legal justification for arresting anyone found outside. If you were arrested at night, you couldn't claim ignorance. Everyone knew about curfew. Being outside was inherently suspicious. This let authorities arrest first and ask questions later, which they did frequently and often violently. Night was when official restraints on power weakened. Guards could beat or rob people with minimal oversight, because who would verify what happened in darkness? This brings us to sleep quality, which was terrible. The segmented sleep pattern wasn't restful. Waking multiple times per night prevents deep sleep. Add alcohol consumption, which also disrupts sleep architecture. Add bells ringing at all hours. Add ambient noise from animals, neighbors, and night workers. Add uncomfortable beds, parasites, and temperature extremes. Medieval people were chronically sleep deprived. They functioned, but only barely. The exhaustion shows in period descriptions. Records mention people falling asleep during sermons, at work, even while walking. Microsleeps, brief lapses where the brain shuts down momentarily, were probably common. The wealthy slept slightly better. They had private rooms, better beds, servants to manage noise. But even they heard the bells. Even they dealt with segmented sleep. Even they consumed alcohol all day. Class provided advantages, but couldn't overcome basic limitations. The king and the peasant both woke to matins bells at midnight. The king just woke in a better bed, still exhausted, but exhausted in silk. Children adapted somewhat better. Young bodies are resilient. They slept through more disturbances. But they also were subject to the same ale consumption, same bail schedules, same disrupted rhythms as adults. Medieval childhood included chronic low-level intoxication and sleep deprivation as baseline conditions. This probably affected development, though without control groups, we can't be sure how. All children experience this. There was no alternative. They grew up thinking constant tiredness was normal, because for them it was. The transition to industrial work made everything worse. Factories required coordination. Workers needed to arrive at the same time. This meant even more bells and whistles organizing life. The factory whistle replaced the church bell, but functioned identically. It told you when to wake, when to work, when to rest. Except factories ran longer hours than monasteries. Shifts extended to 12 or 14 hours. The bells rang more often, imposing tighter control. And because factories could install artificial lighting, night shifts became common in industries that had previously been day only. Early factory workers experienced the worst of both worlds. They still drank heavily because water treatment hadn't improved. They still slept poorly because segmented sleep patterns persisted. But now they worked longer hours under closer supervision with less autonomy. The monastery bell had been annoying but irregular. The factory whistle was relentless. It structured every moment of your day, dividing time into work units that had to be filled with productive labor. The bells that once called monks to prayer now called workers to machines. The sacred rhythm became industrial rhythm. Nothing fundamentally changed except the justification. This is when real resistance began. Workers organized. They demanded shorter hours, better conditions, and the right to sleep without interruption. Early labor movements focused heavily on work time because everyone understood that the current system was literally killing people through exhaustion. Strikes often centered on shift lengths, 10-hour days instead of 12, banning night work for children, requiring rest periods. These seem basic now, but were radical then. Employers argued that production required long hours. Workers countered that production required live-in workers. The debate was really about whether human needs or economic efficiency should govern time. The 8-hour workday emerged slowly from these struggles. It wasn't a gift from enlightened capitalists. It was won through strikes, violence, and political organizing. The idea that 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of leisure created a balanced life took decades to establish. And it only happened in some industries and some countries. Plenty of workers still labored 12 or 14-hour days well into the 20th century. The Global South still does. The 8-hour day is a limited victory in an ongoing war over who controls time. We're now about halfway through our journey from medieval ale to modern sleep deprivation. If you're still here, you clearly appreciate this kind of detailed historical analysis that shows how seemingly separate things like drinking water, church bells, and factory whistles are actually one continuous story of how humans learned to survive terrible conditions by making questionable choices. More of these explorations wait at Candle History if you subscribe. The button's below. Use it if you want. Modern sleep problems trace directly to these medieval patterns. We still fight against natural sleep architecture. Alarm clocks replace bells but function identically, interrupting rest at arbitrary times. We still consume stimulants, caffeine instead of alcohol, but serving the same function of keeping us alert when our bodies want rest. We still work at night, in shifts, disrupting circadian rhythms that evolved over millions of years. The tools have changed. The fundamental conflict between what employers want and what bodies need hasn't. Sleep research shows segmented sleep might actually be healthier than the consolidated 8 hours we aim for. Studies of people without artificial light show they naturally sleep in 2 blocks with wakeful periods between. The medieval pattern might have been closer to optimal than our modern one. Except the medieval pattern was imposed by bells, not chosen based on individual need, and it was combined with alcohol consumption and malnutrition, negating any benefits. The pattern was right, the context was wrong, and nobody involved understood what was happening anyway. So it persisted because tradition, not because it was good. The psychological impact of this disrupted sleep was significant. Chronic sleep deprivation causes irritability, impaired judgment, and depression. Medieval records mention these symptoms constantly. People described feeling disconnected from reality, seeing things that weren't there, experiencing extreme mood swings. Some of this was malnutrition, some was disease, but some was sleep deprivation combined with constant low-level intoxication. Their altered mental states weren't entirely biological. They were also situational, created by the specific conditions of medieval life. This created interesting spiritual experiences. Many medieval mystics reported visions, ecstatic states, and encounters with divine beings. Modern analysis suggests some of these were hallucinations caused by sleep deprivation. Fast for days, sleep poorly, wake repeatedly to pray, and eventually your brain starts generating experiences that feel profound but are actually just neurons misfiring from exhaustion. The line between religious experience and sleep-deprived delirium is probably thinner than medieval people realized. Not all visions were just exhaustion, but some definitely were. The monastery bell schedule accidentally created conditions that produced altered states of consciousness, which were then interpreted as divine contact. Workers experienced similar phenomena. Construction workers reported seeing figures in stone, hearing voices in wind, experiencing strange certainties about meaning and purpose. Some of this was genuine insight. but some was probably just brains desperately trying to make sense of constant exhaustion and mild intoxication. The medieval mind was shaped by physical conditions that modern people rarely experience. They weren't more spiritual or less rational than we are. They were just operating under different constraints. When your baseline mental state includes sleep deprivation and alcohol, your perceptions naturally differ from someone who's well rested and sober. The religious architecture of time deserves more attention. Monks divided the day into hours that weren't equal length. Daytime hours in summer were longer than winter daytime hours because they calculated based on dividing daylight into 12 equal parts. This meant the actual length of an hour varied by season and latitude. For workers whose labor was measured by these bells, this created bizarre situations where you worked longer hours in summer simply because the hours were longer. Employers loved this. Workers hated it. But nobody could change it because the system was tied to religious timekeeping, and challenging that meant challenging the church. This is how quiet rules become oppressive. Nobody decided to make workers labor longer in summer. That emerged from using religious time for secular purposes. The bells rang according to sacred mathematics. Workers responded to bells. Therefore, workers labored according to sacred mathematics. The logic was flawless, and the outcome was exploitation. This pattern, where seemingly neutral systems produce harmful results because nobody examined their assumptions, repeats throughout history. We still see it. Software designed for one purpose gets repurposed for surveillance. Financial tools meant to reduce risk become weapons of extraction. The medieval bell schedule exploited workers through the same mechanism. An elegant system designed for prayer became a method of control. The transition to mechanical clocks changed this, but didn't eliminate it. Mechanical clocks kept consistent time regardless of season. An hour was always the same length. This sounds like progress. Workers cheered initially. But then employers realized they could now demand work measured in actual hours rather than variable religious ones. Summer days were longer, so workers should work more hours, not just longer hours of variable length. The mechanical clock enabled even finer control over labor time. Employers could now measure productivity in minutes. Workers couldn't appeal to religious tradition because clocks were secular. The tool that was supposed to free them from religious time instead bound them to capitalist time, which proved worse. This is a pattern worth emphasizing. New tools don't automatically liberate. They enable different forms of control. The church bell gave way to the factory whistle, gave way to the time clock, gave way to computer monitoring, gave way to your phone tracking every moment. Each transition was sold as improvement. Each actually just refined the mechanisms of observation and control. The medieval worker who woke to bells and the modern worker whose phone tracks their location are experiencing the same fundamental phenomenon. External systems dictating how they use time. The technology changed. The relationship didn't. Alcohol's role in this evolved interestingly. As water quality improved, the necessity of constant drinking decreased. By the 1800s, urban water systems began providing reliably clean water. Workers could hydrate without drinking beer. Employers immediately pushed for sobriety. They didn't care about workers' health. They cared about productivity. Drunk workers produced less and had more accidents. So temperance movements emerged, funded partly by industrialists who wanted sober employees. The rhetoric was moral. The motivation was economic. This created strange alliances between religious crusaders and business interests, both wanting to eliminate alcohol for completely different reasons. Workers resisted. They drunk for generations. It was cultural, it was social, it was how they dealt with terrible conditions. Taking away alcohol without improving conditions was just removing a coping mechanism while maintaining the misery. So workers continued drinking, either secretly or defiantly. Temperance laws were passed and largely ignored. Only when work conditions improved somewhat did alcohol consumption finally decline among industrial workers. They stopped drinking when they no longer needed alcohol to survive the day, which tells you something about what work was like when they did need it. The modern equivalent is complicated. We don't drink water that will kill us, but we do work in ways that damage health. We stare at screens until our eyes hurt. We sit until our backs ache. We work irregular hours that disrupt sleep. We consume caffeine and sugar to maintain alertness. We're not medicating survival with alcohol anymore. We're medicating productivity with stimulants. Different substance, same principle. The job demands more than the body naturally provides, so we chemically modify ourselves to meet those demands. The medieval worker reached for ale. We reach for coffee. Both of us are just trying to make it through another shift. Sleep tracking technology reveals how poorly we actually sleep. Modern people are nearly as sleep deprived as medieval ones. We stay up too late, wake too early, interrupt rest with phones and lights. Our segmented sleep is involuntary, caused by stress and technology rather than bells. But the result is similar. We wake multiple times per night. We struggle to reach deep sleep. We function while exhausted. The medieval world had excuses. Disease, bells, alcohol. What's ours? We have the technology to sleep well. We choose not to use it. Or rather, we build systems that make choosing otherwise nearly impossible. The night shift remains challenging. Studies show night workers have worse health outcomes across almost every metric. Higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, depression, cancer. Their bodies never fully adjust to nocturnal schedules. They exist in permanent jet lag, trying to be awake when every biological system is screaming sleep. We know this. We've known it for decades. Society still demands night workers because economies operate around the clock. Hospitals, factories, transportation, security, all require someone working while others sleep. We've decided that some people's health is an acceptable sacrifice for everyone else's convenience. The medieval fire watcher would understand perfectly. The ethics of this rarely get examined. We've normalized night work to such an extent that questioning it seems naive. Of course, hospitals need staff at night. Of course, factories run constantly. Of course. Except that of course is doing heavy lifting. We could organize differently. We could reduce night work, rotate shifts more carefully, pay significantly more for nocturnal labor. We don't because that would cost money and reduce profits. So instead, we tell night workers their sacrifice is necessary and maybe give them a shift differential. The medieval church told night watchmen their service was holy. Industrialists tell night workers their labor is valuable. Both are lying. The real message is, your health matters less than our needs. Examining this history reveals uncomfortable truths about modern life. We think we've progressed past medieval conditions. In some ways, we have. Water doesn't kill us anymore. Lighting doesn't require fire. We understand germ theory. But in other ways, we're still stuck in patterns established when churches rang bells to wake towns at midnight. We still let external systems dictate our time. We still sacrifice sleep to productivity. We still consume substances to maintain alertness. We still divide society into day people and night people, with night people getting the worse end of that arrangement. The technology is better, but the structure is unchanged. This isn't inevitable. Humans can organize time differently. Some societies have. Afternoon siestas, common in Mediterranean and Latin American cultures, acknowledge that humans get tired and need rest during the day. Flexible work arrangements let people structure their own time. Cultures that value rest over productivity produce happier, healthier people. These models exist. We could adopt them. We don't because our economic systems prioritize efficiency over well-being, profit over rest, productivity over health. The medieval monastery chose prayer over sleep. We choose work. Different God, same sacrifice. The question is whether we'll ever learn. History suggests not. Every generation thinks it's smarter than the previous one. Every generation makes similar mistakes with new tools. The medieval workers believed beer would save them from disease. It did, sort of, while also damaging them differently. We believe caffeine helps us work better. It does, sort of, while also creating dependency and masking exhaustion. Future generations will probably judge our choices as harshly as we judge medieval ones. They'll wonder why we stared at screens all day despite knowing it hurt our eyes. Why we worked ourselves into exhaustion despite understanding sleep's importance. Why we maintained schedules that contradicted biological needs despite having the wealth and technology to do otherwise. The answer, uncomfortable as it is, will be the same answer that explains medieval behavior. Because the systems demanded it and individuals had no choice. The medieval worker drank because the alternative was death from disease. The modern worker works because the alternative is poverty. Neither situation offered real choice. Both were constraints dressed up as freedom. Drink this ale or die. Work these hours or starve. Choose. Except that's not choice. That's coercion with better marketing. Drink this ale or die. Work these hours or starve. Choose. Thank you for spending these hours exploring how alcohol became life-saving medicine and how night work rewired human existence. If this kind of historical analysis resonates with you, demonstrating how medieval patterns still shape modern life, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to Candle History. What aspect of this surprised you most? Do you see these patterns in your own life? Comment below. I read everything. We began with a mug of weak ale in medieval London. We end with your alarm clock in whatever city you're watching from. Between those points lies a continuous story of how humans adapted to terrible conditions by creating systems that solved immediate problems while creating longer-term ones. The ale solved the water crisis while normalizing constant intoxication. The bells solved coordination problems while destroying natural sleep. The factory whistle solved scheduling challenges while eliminating autonomy. Each innovation was a choice between different kinds of harm, and we consistently chose the harm that let us keep producing. The medieval world drank itself through each day because sobriety was deadly. The modern world medicates itself through each day because productivity demands it. We've replaced ale with coffee, church bells with alarm clocks, fire watchers with security cameras. The specific mechanisms have changed. The fundamental dynamic hasn't. External systems control your time. Economic pressures override biological needs. Sleep is negotiable. Rest is optional. Work is mandatory. That's not progress. That's the same medieval logic running on better hardware. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The medieval workers who started their days with ale weren't foolish. They were adapting to circumstances that offered no good choices, only different versions of harm. We're doing the same thing. Future historians will look at our caffeine dependency, our sleep deprivation, our phone addiction with the same confusion we feel examining medieval ale consumption. They'll wonder why we tolerated such obvious harm. The answer will be because the alternative seemed worse, because the systems demanded it, because individual choice operates within collective constraints, because change in the system required coordinated action that exhausted, isolated individuals couldn't organize. That worker in 1347 reaching for his morning ale and you reaching for your morning coffee are the same person separated by centuries. Both trying to survive conditions neither created and neither can fully control. Both adapting as well as possible. Both paying costs they shouldn't have to pay. The ale didn't save him in the end. It just delayed his death while making life bearable. Your coffee won't save you either, but it'll get you through the next shift, which is all anyone could ever really hope for in systems designed to extract rather than sustain. The bells are still ringing. We just stopped hearing them. The night is still dangerous. We just pretend we've conquered it with electricity. The water might not kill us anymore, but the things we drink instead might. We solved the immediate problems our ancestors faced while creating new ones they couldn't have imagined. And someday, if humanity survives long enough, future generations will solve the problems we created while inventing fresh horrors we can't imagine. That's the pattern. That's the lesson. That's why spending hours understanding how medieval workers drank and slept matters. Because we're still those workers. We always have been. We probably always will be. The ale may have been safer than water, but that doesn't mean it was safe. It just meant it was the best of bad options. Look around. That's still where we live. In the best of bad options. Making do, adapting, surviving, exhausted. The medieval worker would recognize our lives instantly. We'd recognize his. Nothing fundamental has changed, except we lie about it better. We call our beer coffee, and our bells notifications, and our nighttime oppression the gig economy. Different words for the same old story. Humans figuring out how to survive while powerful systems extract everything we've got to give and demand more. So here's to the medieval alewife, brewing in her kitchen, keeping her neighbors alive with fermented grain. And here's to you, making your morning coffee, preparing for another day in systems that demand more than bodies can sustainably give. You're connected across centuries by the simple fact that both of you woke up today and reached for a drink that would let you keep going. That's not triumph, but it's not failure either. It's just what adaptation looks like when you're trying to stay alive in conditions designed for something other than human flourishing. The ale kept them alive. The coffee keeps you going. And the bells, whatever form they take, keep ringing until you answer. The night changes everything because darkness reveals what daylight hides. In the dark, you can't see the systems constraining you. You can only feel them. The medieval worker felt the cold, the exhaustion, the danger. We feel the stress, the anxiety, the desperation. Different specifics, same sensation of being caught in something larger than ourselves that doesn't care about our needs. They adapted with ale and segmented sleep, We adapt with caffeine and sleeping pills. They rang bells to coordinate. We send notifications. They worked until their bodies broke. We work until our minds crack. And in the darkness, when the world is quiet and you can't sleep because anxiety won't let you, you're connected to every person throughout history who laid awake at night wondering how much longer they could sustain the unsustainable. The answer, historically, is quite a while. Humans are remarkably resilient. We adapt to terrible conditions and call it normal. We survive the unsustainable and call it success. We damage ourselves in service of systems and call it responsibility. The medieval worker drank ale every day for his entire life, shortening his lifespan, impairing his health, but keeping him alive long enough to build cathedrals we still admire. You'll drink coffee every day, shorten your lifespan, impair your health, and build whatever cathedrals this age demands. And future historians will admire what you built while wondering why you paid such a price for it. The ale was safer than water. The bells organized chaos. The night work kept cities functioning. All true, all necessary, all harmful. That tension never resolves. It just shifts. We find new ways to hurt ourselves while surviving, new systems to adapt to, new substances to depend on, new schedules to obey. And through it all, we keep thinking this time will be different. This time we'll find the balance. This time we'll create systems that work for humans instead of humans working for systems. And maybe someday we will. But that day isn't today. Today, we wake to alarms, reach for coffee, and start another shift in systems that were already old when medieval workers reached for their morning ale. Different era, same story. Different drinks, same thirst. Different bells, same demands. And the night, as always, changes everything, while changing nothing at all.